Hi everybody and welcome to the History of D&D Weekly. Tonight is June 6th, 2020, and I'm your host, DM Gallibond. Hey everybody, History of D&D Weekly. This is a new series that I aim to put out every Saturday, and it is going to be focused on the reboot of an idea I started last year. Didn't quite work out exactly the way that I intended it to. So, and in going back and looking at what went wrong, I think my main problem is that I did not spend enough time educating potential players on just how different old systems of D&D are. So we're going to look tonight a little bit at what the history of D&D is all about, and then we're going to discuss character creation from the original rule set of D&D. So what is the history of D&D? Well, it's going to be a multiple campaign arc that plays through every edition of the rules of D&D, all in the same game world. And the idea is to build the history of the game world as we play the games. So we will start in a Stone Age, late Stone Age, early Bronze Age style civilization, which, if you think about in the real world, that goes back to things like the Sumerians and the Phoenicians and those sorts of folks who were operating in the Mediterranean area. Um, you know, in There were some of the cultures that were referenced in some of the Old Testament Bible stories, and they were civilizations that predated the Greeks and the Romans and even the Egyptians to a certain extent. And most of the traces of those civilizations are completely gone these days. But they did give us saying, like, if you've ever heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh, that was something that came out of Phoenician culture, and there are some stone tablets and some things like that are still extant. Not a whole lot of archaeological sites or a whole lot of structures or anything that are left from their civilization. So we'll start with playing an original D&D game in a civilization kind of like that. And then each time we come back to a new campaign, the clock is going to advance several hundred or maybe several thousand years uh, from the previous campaign to the next campaign. And we will keep playing campaigns all the way up until we reach the current edition. Now, right now, as I'm recording this, the current edition is 5th edition. But since some of these older editions have a very high level cap, it's potential that there might be a 6th edition of D&D out, and people might be playing 6th edition by the time we catch up to the current edition. So we will play as many editions of the game as we have to come all the way up to the present time in D&D. So we will also, for this particular game world, we will also establish some of the critical things of how did certain things come to pass. If you go back to the original game, there's a very small number of classes. There's a very small number of playable races. There's a lot of the iconic monsters and iconic NPC races that we think about that don't even exist. And for instance, there's only one kind of elf in original D&D. Um, there's no distinction between wood elves, high elves, certainly no mention of Eladrin, and there's not even any drow in that. So, one of the things we have a chance to explore in this first game is, well, how did the elves split? How did the drow become drow? Now, there's a lot of lore that, in general, describes how that happened, but you know, there's a lot of ways to actually go through and explore the way that that split happened in this particular game world. And then, there's only one kind of dwarf. And how did gnomes and half-orcs become playable races? In the original set, if you were not a human, you could have one of three classes that were demi-humans. And yes, demi-humans, or what we would call humanoid races in later editions of the game, though there were only three of them that were playable, and there was no such thing as like an elf fighter or an elf wizard or an elf cleric. There was just an elf. All elves were the same. There were monolithic races, and the same with dwarves, and the same with halflings. And you couldn't even play a gnome, and you couldn't even play a half-orc. So we'll kind of investigate how these things came to pass in D&D, or at least in this game world, as we are going through and playing these games. Another thing, because we are setting all of these games in the same game world, the events of each campaign will form the history, the legends, the heroes, and perhaps even lend to the celestial pantheon of deities for future campaigns in the same game world. So, you could set up something where your character in the original game becomes like, establishes like a noble line. And then every character you play in subsequent games can maybe trace their lineage all the way back to that first character that you were playing, if you want to do it that way. Or your character might, from the original game, might transcend mortality and become one of the immortals. And, maybe early on become a demigod, and then if they uh, gain more and more power, they might even become a full deity. So your character that you play, like let's say in the third edition game or the fourth edition game, might actually be a devotee of the deity that was your character in the original D&D game. So this is kind of the thing that I want to do with this first or with this history of D&D. Um, and then there's also heirloom magic items that I like the idea. So if your um, character in the first game gets a really cool magic item. It doesn't necessarily have to be a super powerful magic item, but maybe a meaningful magic item that was used in a meaningful adventure. Then that item might become something that gets passed down through their line, and so your future characters could have that item as something that they adventure with. Now, of course, from edition to edition, the rules about certain magic items change, and there's suggestions about when a character should be able to have magical items of certain power level. So, there would be things like, well, maybe the item, got lost somehow, and then your character will eventually find a rumor of where it is now, or a um, an ancestor between your first character and your third character, had a bad gambling habit, and they squandered it, and they lost that item in a in a gambling debt, and now your character in the third game, you figure out where that is, and one of the side adventures that you have is going and tracking that thing down and getting it back into your family. So there's different ways we can do that, just so that you don't have a level 1 character that has an item that's way too powerful for a level 1 character to have. And then of course uh, the particulars of a weapon or an item, or the way items work, may change from one edition to another, and we will just adjust the item to match the rules of the new edition of the game. All right, so that is kind of the theory behind the History of D&D game. All right, now actually I want to switch over here from this to the rule book that we will be using. We're going to be using as the rule book for the original D&D game. We're going to be using this Rules Cyclopedia. Original D&D was first published in the early 1970s. I believe 1974 is when it first came out. And it continued to be a game that actually sat eventually alongside Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which came out in the early 80s. But original D&D and AD&D were together all the way through the 80s and into the early 90s. And they kept adding and refining rules for both systems. So this rules cyclopedia is kind of a comprehensive collection of all the rules for original D&D, and it was published in 1991. And so it includes a lot of things that may not have been in the old basic set, that if you had the old red box set with the basic rules, and you may not have seen some of these. But we're going to use this because this gives us a flavor of what original D&D eventually matured into. And today on this show, we're going to focus on the steps in character creation. Roughly what you do is you create the ability scores, very similar to later games, but there's certain rules that we're going to try to be faithful to the rules here, because I think one of the fun things about trying different editions of the game is just seeing in some cases how restrictive some of the rule sets are, and in some cases how forward thinking and just how different the rules are than the current edition of the game. So you roll for ability scores. We'll talk about what a prime requisite is, choosing a class, and we'll just talk about the choice of a class, which is based on your ability scores, and we won't detail anything about the classes. We'll do that in a future segment of this show here. Adjust the ability scores. There's a way you can adjust ability scores. Roll for your hit points, roll for money, buy your equipment, determine other numbers and rolls, basically your armor class, attack roll, saving throws, etc., etc. Note adjustments for the ability scores, and then what those are, score by score. Choose your character alignment. Select a name, personality, and background. Determine character height and weight. Earn experience. Actually, that's actually looking a little bit ahead, is how you will earn experience, and what and it's not until we get into the classes that we'll talk about how much XP it takes to raise a new level. And then hit dice and hit points, and prime requisites and experience points. So what happens when you go up a level with your hit dice and hit points, and how your prime requisite and affects your experience points. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the steps in character creation. All right, it's a 12-step process to create a character. and we go step by step here. So what original D&D requires you to do to create a character is it requires you to write down the ability scores and then roll for those scores in order. And the order that they use is they use strength, intelligence, wisdom, dexterity, constitution, charisma. Now, if you look at a 5e character sheet, you'll see it's the same abilities, but the order is a little bit different. And then what you do is you simply do 3d6. You don't do 4d6. You don't have any point buy. You don't have any other kind of options. It's just roll a straight 3d6 for each of those abilities. And the first 3d6 you roll is for your strength. It's not where you roll 6 sets of 3d6 and then figure out how you want to put them in. You've got to roll those in order. So your first score is your strength, second score is your intelligence, third is your wisdom, fourth is dexterity, fifth is your constitution, and sixth is your charisma. And what this does is this allows the dice to tell you, the player, what class your character should be. Instead of you trying to decide ahead of time what class your character should be and then arranging the scores to match what you want, you allow the dice to tell you what class you should play. Now, I like this change. I think it's liberating for a lot of players because a lot of players I know will get stuck. They will think that they are only capable of playing, let's say, a fighter, or they're only capable of playing a cleric. They couldn't possibly play a wizard. They couldn't possibly play a thief, whatever it is. Or that class isn't any fun. I don't want to play it. Well, okay. If you're going to play in this game, you're going to take all those attitudes and you're going to put them aside. And you are going to allow the dice to tell you, at least in this edition, what class you should play. And then you are going to learn how to work within that class and how to build up that class. And one of the interesting things about that is that it may mean that you get a whole party of entirely fighters or a whole party of entirely magic users, which actually is fine in this edition because of something that we will look at in a future episode, which is the system of henchmen and retainers that you have in original D&D. So, tells you all about what each of the abilities means, and you can look at that a little bit later. Actually, in the description of this video, I'm going to put a link to where this rule cyclopedia exists in the DM's Guild, because you can buy a PDF copy from the DM's Guild. Also, when I open invitations for this game, I will go ahead and I will have in my Discord server, I have several channels there where I have put together, from some of my own documents, I've put together basically what some of these rules are. The reason that I do that is because I don't want people to feel like they have to go out and spend money to play a game. As a DM, I want to try to make it as easy for the players to access the information as they want to, and then if they decide that they like this edition enough to go out and spend the money to buy the rule book for it, then they can go ahead and do that. All right, so there's a prime requisite. Each class requires prowess in one of the abilities. So for a fighter, has strength. Fighter needs a good strength. Clerics need a good wisdom because of their spell casting. Thieves need a good dexterity because of things they do, like finding and removing traps and sneaking around. And then wizards need a high intelligence because of their particular spell casting. And then you choose the class, and the class, of course, is based on um, what your high scores are. Now there are 4 human classes, and there are 3 demi-human classes, and then there are 2 special character classes. So the 4 human classes are cleric, fighter, magic user, and thief. And if you are playing a cleric, playing a fighter, playing a magic user, playing a thief, all of those require that your race be human. There's no such thing as a dwarf cleric. There's no such thing as an elf fighter. There's no such thing as a halfling rogue. It's just humans that get to play those character classes. Now, there are 3 demi-human classes that are called dwarf, elf, and halfling. Now, dwarf, elf, and halfling sound like they're races, and in later editions of the game, they are races. But in this edition of the game, they are separate classes because it requires higher scores in more than one ability to qualify to play an elf or a dwarf or a halfling. And then the special character classes, you have mystics, which require quite advanced, quite high scores in several different abilities. That's a human class. And a druid is like a cleric, and in fact, you cannot play a druid until you reach 9th level in cleric. And it's not 9th level in a lawful cleric or a chaotic cleric. It has to be 9th level in a neutral cleric. And then going forward from 9th level, you can choose to either continue raising levels as a druid or continue raising levels as a cleric. So that's one of the really, really interesting things about this, is that druids don't get to start at first level. They have to become a 9th level cleric before they can become a druid. And then you have the prime requisite and the by character class. So clerics require wisdom, fighters strength, magic users intelligence, thieves dexterity. Dwarves require a high strength, and a constitution of 9. Elves require a high strength and intelligence, and that intelligence must be at least 9. The halflings require a strength and a dexterity. The dexterity must be 9, and also they must have a constitution of 9. Druids rely on wisdom. They have to be neutral alignment and attain 9th level as a cleric. Then the mystics require strength and dexterity. Then they also have to have a wisdom of 13 and a dexterity of 13. So the mystic is really the toughest class of all to play. And the druid, you cannot start playing druid until 9th level. So there's really only 8 possible choices to begin a character at first level. All right, and it talks a little bit about the descriptions of the classes. Clerics are dedicated to a worthy cause. Now, it's interesting that it says it doesn't necessarily dedicate themselves to a god, but they dedicate themselves to a cause, and they wield magic, and they can use almost as many weapons and armor types as a fighter. So that's kind of an interesting distinction in this one. The fighter's character's main skill is prowess in arms, heavily armored or lightly armored, and the prime requisite is strength. Magic user wields magic, little or nothing in the way of fighting ability, and very slow to gain power. But in this edition of the game, magic users wind up by end game being by far the most powerful class in the game. But the trade-off for that is that they are very, very squishy in the early levels, and they're very easy to kill early on. Now, a thief has spying abilities and sneaking abilities. They can set traps. They can remove traps. They can find, they can sneak around and pick locks and do all sorts of things. Dwarf is a sturdy demi-human, resembles a fighter, but he has some special abilities and restrictions. Elf is a nimble demi-human, and he's a combination of fighter and magic user. Not quite as tough as a fighter, and doesn't ever quite get as many spells as a magic user, but he is comfortable doing both. He or she is comfortable doing both. Halfling is small demi-human, many abilities similar to a fighter. Also noted for their ability in woodsmanship. They also have the ability to kind of hide in plain sight, especially outdoors. And it's very clear when you look at the rule set that the people being Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, who developed the original rules of D&D, they were very heavily influenced by the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. There's a lot of homages to Tolkien scattered, sprinkled throughout the rule set. Druids are a special kind of spellcaster that starts off as a cleric and then basically after 9th level dedicates himself to nature and the spirits of nature. And Mystic is kind of a warrior monk. They have unarmed fighting style, and they gain all kinds of incredible special abilities as they go on. All right, then you adjust the ability scores, and you can do that by trading 2 points from one ability in order to raise your prime requisite by 1 point. So remember how I said before, when you roll the 6 abilities, you let the dice determine which class you're going to be? Well, that's not exactly and not entirely true, because you can adjust, but anytime you want to raise one score, and you can only raise your desired prime requisite by 1 point, you have to lower another score by 2 points. And you do have to take from 2 points from one. You can't take 1 point from this ability and 1 point from another ability in order to add 1 point to your prime requisite. It has to be 2 points from any one ability to add 1 point to your prime requisite. And the limitations of that, you cannot lower any ability score below 9, and you can never lower your dexterity, your constitution, or your charisma. So you can only trade out of your strength and your intelligence and your wisdom. So you can only trade out of those, and you can only add points to your prime requisite. You can't add points to any other ability score. So once you've rolled the ability, and then it gives you some exhaustive examples there. Then you roll for hit points. And the hit point table is very flat and a little bit low in this edition compared to early editions. So, a cleric gets only 1d6 hit points. A fighter gets only 1d8 hit points to start with. A magic user and a thief only get 1d4. Nobody gets more than 1d8. Now notice, druids, it says an asterisk, does not apply. Well, that's because the rules for hit points change for every class somewhere around level 9. at or about level 9, and in a couple of cases it's all the way as high as level 12, you quit rolling for hit points at every level, and instead of rolling for hit points, you just add either 1 hit point per level or 2 hit points per level. And if you have a constitution bonus that allows you to to add hit points for every hit die, you quit figuring that constitution bonus after level 9 as well. So that's another interesting thing. So, you can go all the way up to level 36 in this edition, but it would be rare to find a character that had, you know, um, okay, so 26 hit points, and then let's say 9 times, if you were a fighter, 9 times 8, that's 72, and then 26, so a little over 100 hit points, but you wouldn't ever have anything, like where it's like 36 d8, hit points. You'd never have that. Roll for money. There's no starting packs. There's no starting equipment by class. You just roll 3d6 multiplied by 10. That's your gold. That's how much you have to spend on equipment. If you roll poorly on that, well, then your character's going to start with not a whole lot. If you roll really well, hey, money bags, you're going to be able to start with a lot of equipment. All right, then you buy that equipment, and that's elsewhere in the book. We're not going to worry about that right now. If you're a spellcaster, now magic users know one spell at their first level of experience. And the interesting thing is, and elves also get one spell at first level, but clerics don't learn their first spell until second level. Remember it said a little bit that clerics are almost as good as fighters. Well, that's because at first level they essentially are a fighter with a high wisdom. They are devoted to a cause, and they basically have to prove themselves at first level before the cause or the divinity or the power or whatever it is that they're devoted to will grant them the ability to cast spells. So that's something that I don't think carried over into any other edition of the game, but it's a very unique and interesting thing about this original set of rules. You determine the other numbers and rolls, so armor class, attack rolls, saving throws. And this is where some people get really tripped up because saving throws and armor class are backwards in this game. Okay, in modern versions of the game, the higher the armor class, the tougher you are to hit. But in this version of the game, the lower your armor class, the tougher you are to hit. So, a person with normal dexterity and no armor has an armor class of 9, and it goes all the way down to 0. Leather armor, scale armor, chain, banded, plate mail, suit armor, which is basically, if you think of a jousting knight, the full blown, all the metal plates over him, that's what they consider suit armor. And then if you add a shield, you subtract 1 from any armor class there. So you can have negative armor classes, but you will see something in here that are you'll hear a lot of old timers talk about THAC0, which is 2-hit armor class 0, and at first level. For all of the classes, they share the same THAC0, and that THAC0 is 19. So it takes a 19 on your attack rolls to hit an opponent with armor class 0. Now, most enemies you fight at first level are not going to be armor class 0. They're going to have significantly worse armor class than that. So you're not going to have to roll a 19. And then there's all kinds of other modifiers and everything on your attack rolls that you would look at, and we'll take a peek at that in just a minute. Let's see, where do we go? Okay, so here's the FACO for all first level characters. So to hit an armor class of 9, you need a 10, an 8, you need 11, 7, you need a 12. So you see that it goes for every armor class going down, the attack roll you need to hit goes up. And then, obviously, the highest, well, not the highest, but um, if you roll a 20 on the die, you can hit any armor class. So now that's not a modified 20, but that's a natural 20. So there's no such thing as a critical hit in this edition, but if you roll a natural 20, you can hit any armor class, even like an armor class of -5 or an even better armor class. So that's a thing. Then there's saving throws. Now, saving throws work a little bit different. The saving throws, you need to roll under the number on a d20. So, if you're a first level elf, the saving throws are 12, 13, 13, 15, and 15. And those saving throws are not the kind of saving throws we're used to based on abilities in modern D&D, but they are against Death Ray or Poison is a 12, Magic Wand is a 13, Paralysis or Turn to Stone is a 13, Dragon Breath is a 15, Spells or Staves is a 15. And so you basically have to know what the effect is that you're rolling against, and then you figure out which one. Then you roll a 20, 20-sided die, and you have to hit the number. Now wait a minute, am I correct? Okay. Character. Okay. Then you then your wisdom is high or low enough for a bonus or penalty. Record that on your characters. This bonus or penalty affects your character's saving throw versus spells. So it's only saving throw versus spells that you adjust based on your wisdom score. Now, this is a good time to talk about the adjustments. The bonuses and penalties are much flatter in this edition than they even are in 5e. So at 2 to 3, you have a -3 penalty, 4 to 5, -2, 6 to 8, a -1, 9 to 12 is no adjustment, 13 to 15 is +1, 16 to 17 is +2, 18 is +3. So go through each of the abilities and see what it will do, and so on and so forth. So, the bonuses and penalties over here on this table. For strength, it applies to attack rolls for melee weapons and unarmed combat, damage rolls for melee and thrown weapons, and opening doors. Intelligence is the number of languages you can have. Your general skills, that's an optional rule set, and we do use it because it enhances the sort of situations that your character gets bonuses in if we use the general skills. So that's one reason why I like it. Wisdom is saving throws versus spells. Dexterity is your attack rolls for thrown or missile weapons and your armor class. Constitution, your hit points per experience level, and your charisma is reactions from NPCs. And then, of course, there's tables for all of this stuff. So, what does it mean if your intelligence is, within these ranges? And then also for your charisma, that's effective because you remember we talked a little bit about henchmen and retainers. Well, this is your the maximum number of retainers you can have and their morale. And our morale score is on a is based on a roll of 2d6. And if you roll over the morale, then that means that your retainers are not willing to do what you want them to do. You have to roll their morale or under on a 2d6. So you want that morale to be as high as possible. So if you have an 18 charisma, their reaction adjustment is +3, and you can have 7 retainers. And then if there's a situation where they have to check morale, then roll a 10 or lower on 2d6. If you roll 11 or 12 up, sorry, you're out of luck. All right, then alignment is the code of behavior or way of life that guides the action. And an interesting thing here is a joke I like to say about original D&D. Original D&D is so poor. Now that's your cue to say, how poor is it? Well, they were so poor in original D&D that they could only afford 3 alignments: law, chaos, and neutrality. They did not have an axis of good and evil in the alignments. There was only the 3: law, chaos, and neutrality. And so the player can choose whatever alignment they want their character to have, but the DM in this edition is supposed to monitor the way the character actually plays their or the player actually plays their character. And if they claim that they want their person to be lawful, but they do a lot of things like, they um, go around doing a lot of thieving or randomly killing people or randomly avoiding helping people in distress, then okay, maybe that's not a lawful character. Maybe that's more of a neutral character, or depending on how severe their actions are, could even be a chaotic character. Now, um, chaos is not necessarily evil, but there's a clear uh, you can kind of see them trying to anticipate uh, the outcry from all the outraged parents that think their little darlings are getting sucked into devil worship by playing D&D. And they're trying to make it very clear, that, oh, lawful is really good and whatnot. And, oh, you probably wouldn't want to play chaotic because nobody trusts a chaotic character. Or at least if you work at it, you wouldn't want to admit it to anybody, which is kind of funny. Good tea. All right. Then let's see. Talks a little bit more about that. Then alignment behavior. That's where and then there's alignment languages. And yes, every alignment has a language, which that I don't know. To me, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But hey, that's in the rules. So if you are um, a lawful cleric, you speak common and you speak lawful. Um, yeah, whatever. Um, then you can select the name, personality, and background. And name is just um, maybe based on whatever the setting is. Um, and I'm pretty I'm pretty open about the names because one of the things I like my players to do is I like my players to describe a little bit within the limitations that we have set. So knowing that the world is kind of a late Stone Age, almost early Bronze Age type of world, and those kinds of cultures, uh, pick a name and you can pick a name and then tell me a little bit about where your character is from. Your character doesn't have to be from the area where we're starting to adventure. Um, you can be from a different part of the world. And if you have an interesting idea about what's over there, you may say, oh, far to the east, there's this land of blah, 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 blah. Well, I may do that, and then I may adjust that a little bit and tell you, okay, not far to the east, but far to the north, or far to the south, or far to the west. Just because I know the geography of the game world, and maybe it makes more sense for um, the land that you want to be located somewhere else. All right. Then personality. Um, it's just there's not really any kind of table or anything you use. It just basically gives you ideas for your personality and your background of how to write that. That's basically writing your character's backstory. Then there are tables for determining the height and weight. And one of the things that you'll notice is that the weight um, is all designated in coins, which is abbreviated CN. So uh, 2,000 coins is a weight of 200 pounds, or 1,000 coins is a weight of 100 pounds. And then it goes race or class, race by race. Human characters, what their height is, and notice there's nothing to roll on. You just pick, and then it gives you the average weight for male and female, and in each of the races. So humans, dwarves, elves, halflings. Then um, there's experience points, and your prime requisite has a has an effect on your experience points. Now, notice it has by classes your prime requisite being really, really low, and your prime requisite has to be 9 or above to start in a class. But there are things in the game that can damage your ability scores. So you could wind up eventually with a cleric, let's say, that has a 3 wisdom um, at some point. Now, if your prime requisite is 3 to 5, you lose 20% of, well, you have a penalty of 20% on every on your experience points that you gain. So in other words, what this means is the end of a session, if your party gets 100 experience points each, then if you have a really low prime requisite, instead of getting 100, you only get 80 experience points. You get penalized for having a low score. Conversely, if you have a really high score, 16 to 18, you get to add 10%. So that same example, the party gets 100 experience points each. Well, instead of 100, you get 110 experience points because you get a 10% bonus. And then that's really based on all of the different classes. All right. And then you calculate, and it gives you a whole rigmarole about calculating the experience points. All right. And then, there's something that is here. So maximum levels. All right. So each player will roll hit dice for his character from first experience level to ninth, or 8th in the case of halflings, who can only go up to 8th level. Starting with 10th or ninth in the case of halflings, the character will receive a preset number of hit points appropriate for his character class. Constitution to hit points applies only to the hit dice the player rolls. They do not apply to the hit points added at higher levels. And then maximum levels. Now, there's an interesting thing about the demi-humans. Demi-humans have a level cap which is much lower than the human characters. Um, this is I'm not quite sure why they did that. Now they do give the when we get into the classes later on, you'll see that there are tables where they can keep gaining experience points, and at certain experience point totals, they don't gain a level, but they get additional abilities. So it's kind of strange how that goes. And they will wind up having a few less hit points, but they can still gain magic items and be harder to hit and, do those types of things and whatnot. So, halflings can only rise to 8th level. Dwarves and elves cannot get any higher than 12th level. Druids are only able to achieve 30th level, and that is only after a special challenge. So, druids have a hierarchy that as you get to a certain point, you then have to fight for one of the spots in the hierarchy. And when we talk about the druid class, we'll go through all of that. And then the other 4 human classes, cleric, fighter, magic user, thief, can go all the way up to 36th level. And mystics can only go up to 16th level. All right, so once they reach their maximum experience level, they do not stop earning experience. They can always gain more. And, like I said, with the demi-humans, there's certain things that they get at different XP milestones after they achieve their level cap. Alrighty then. So that is going to pretty much do it for our discussion of character creation in original D&D. I hope you have found this discussion interesting, illuminating. If you are interested in playing a game with this rule set based on what you've seen here, go ahead and let me know in the comments, because within the next couple of months I'm going to be recruiting for a campaign in Roll20. Roll20 actually has a really nice original D&D character sheet that does all of the calculations and all the math for you in the same way that the 5th edition character sheet in Roll20 does those calculations. And what I'm going to try to do in this time around is I'm going to try to play through the starter set from 5e, but present that to you using the original D&D rules. This is going to be a way just to take maybe something that's a familiar story, either a story that you've played through yourself a couple of times in 5th edition, or that you've heard people tell you about. So it's not really a whole lot of surprise, not a bit of thing, but you will be able to see how it works using the original edition rules instead of the 5th edition rules. And then once we get through that starting adventure, we will then actually go into the actual campaign, and you will create a new character for the actual campaign. And maybe we can take those characters that you use in the starter set game, and we can sprinkle those around as NPCs. Maybe a contact that your character knows, something like that. All right. Well, like I said, that's going to do it for this edition of the game, or this edition of the show. Please check back here next week, where you'll find information on actually the classes. We'll go start talking a little bit about the different character classes in the game, and I think we're going to spend one episode on each one. This turned out to be a little bit long, so I think I'm going to focus on one episode for each class so that these will be a little bit shorter. All right, everybody, take care. Have a fantastic week, and we will talk to you later. Good night, everyone.